The fire did not roar like other fires. It did not scream or crack with the wild hunger of burning timber. Instead, it moved slow, steady, deliberate, as though guided by a hand unseen. It licked along the cotton rows in a black tide, turning white blossoms to ash before the wind could scatter them. And those who woke that night swore the flames were not flames at all, but shadows glowing red from within. Ash fell like a false winter, soft, endless, covering the porches, the fences, the dogs that howled and choked in their chains. It fell until the fields looked pale again, but it was not purity that covered them. It was the dust of voices long crushed under the weight of that land. And in the hush between crackles, the voices began to stir. They did not belong to the living. No, they dragged their syllables through smoke and soot. They tangled in the rafters of barns. They hissed through split windows, all repeating a name with the patience of something that had waited far too long. Naomi, Naomi, Naomi. The name bled into the sky, yet no mouth moved. No throat carried it, no lips parted. For Naomi's lips had been sealed long ago. Sealed not with thread, but with silence forced upon her. Silence of law, silence of lash. Silence of being unseen, unheard, uncounted. And still she had found a way to speak. Her tongue now made of flame. Her lungs of smoke. Her words carried by the burning. Some men ran into the night with buckets and barrels, shouting for water, shouting for order. Yet the river lay swollen and dark, its banks still and unmoving, as if even the water would not rise against the fire's will, and their buckets came back heavy with silence, sloshing nothing at all. God help us, whispered the overseer's wife, clutching her rosary, as the beads slipped like melting pearls through her fingers. This is no fire of men, this is judgment walking in light. But judgment did not walk. It crawled and it coiled. It seared paths across the fields where the slaves once bent their backs under the sun. It bent toward the great house where the family still slept, their windows glowing orange as though dawn had come early. Yet dawn would never come for them again, and the whispering voices grew thicker, layered so many that they sounded like a choir rising from beneath the soil, and the smoke shaped itself into faces, faces with hollow sockets and open mouths, faces pressing against the night sky, yearning upward, all chanting the same name, until the very cotton stalks seemed to bend toward the sound Naomi. Naomi, Naomi, a child saw her first, or what the child thought was her, standing among the stalks with her dress torn and her hair a crown of sparks. She did not move. She only stood, and the fire curled around her like a veil. Yet her face was not her face. It was too many faces at once, yet blurred and split and shimmered with the weight of others behind it. And when the child tried to call out, no sound left her throat, only smoke in the town. Miles away, sleepers stirred, some clutching their chests, some thrashing as if drowning in dreams too thick to escape. One old preacher sat upright in his cot and swore aloud, though no one heard him. The fields have remembered. The fire reached the house at last. And for a moment all stilled, as if the night held its breath. The roof sagged but did not collapse. The windows glowed but did not shatter. The family inside did not scream, no cry escaped. Only the sound of slow, calm breathing, as if they were already gone, already claimed, or lulled into a deeper sleep by something that had no need of fire to smother them. And when the roof did fall, it fell without sound. Only ash rose, falling again like pale snow over a land that would never be white by dawn. The sky was bruised and grey, the earth cracked and smoking, and in the middle of it all, untouched, upright, there stood a single stalk of cotton, blackened yet unburnt, its bloom ash white, and on its petals written in soot, a name repeated like a curse. Naomi and those who saw it could not turn their eyes away, for the bloom bent slowly toward them as if listening, as if waiting for another voice to answer the call. They said she was not praying, not the way others prayed, for her knees sank into mud that swallowed sound, and her hands pressed against roots that drank more than water. The swamp had no church, no altar, only a cathedral of cypress knees rising like broken teeth from black water. And yet Naomi bent her head as though before a God who listened. The night was thick, the kind that pressed upon skin, heavy with gnats and silence, and she whispered, words too soft for ears, words stitched from pain and patience, words that had no place in hymns sung under white rafters. Some said it was not language at all, but a rhythm, a pulse, a thrum that seeped into the roots and carried downward. Naomi, breathed one of the field girls who followed her from afar, hiding among reeds. Who do you speak to? But Naomi did not turn. She did not startle. She only leaned closer, her lips brushing bark, her breath sinking into the hollow where water dripped like blood from the earth's veins. The swamp answered, or so they swore, not with sound but with movement, ripples spreading against no wind, branches bowing though no hand pressed them, frogs silent, crickets silenced, the whole night leaning toward her, waiting, trembling like a beast bridled. Some swore the water spoke back, carrying a promise too heavy for the living. They said it gurgled her name, pulling it low and long, Naomi, until the water itself seemed to choke on it, until the reeds shook as if coughing up a secret too deep to release. She rose then, slow, her face streaked not with tears but with mud smeared black as ink, her eyes hollow yet burning with some private fire, and she whispered to the unseen girl behind her, though her lips did not move, "They will sleep, and the earth will wake." The field girl fled, stumbling, clutching her chest as though something unseen gripped her ribs. She would never again speak of what she saw, but her hands, even decades later, bore faint stains as though cypress sap had seeped into her veins. Naomi returned to the quarters silent, yet her steps carried a rhythm none could forget, a slow drag, a weighted tread like roots shifting beneath soil, like something rising from beneath. And those who shared her walls swore that in her sleep she spoke not in dreams but in rivers, her breath flowing like water against stone, carrying names none dared to repeat. The swamp grew restless in the nights that followed. Trees sagged as though burdened. Owls turned their heads to the earth instead of the sky. Dogs howled at mud rather than moon, and lanterns burned low when carried near its edge, flame shrinking, retreating, as if afraid. And on the seventh night the preacher himself, pressed by whispers of witchcraft and unholy bargains, came to see. He carried scripture in one hand, salt in the other. But when he reached the cypress grove, his tongue thickened, his words tangled. He found himself muttering the psalms backward, as though the swamp took hold of his throat, twisting prayer into curse. When Naomi appeared at the edge, lantern light framed her but did not touch her. She stood as though half in shadow, her skin damp with swamp air, her hands blackened by muck, and though he raised his Bible high, the preacher felt his knees weaken. For her eyes reflected not the lantern but the water, dark and bottomless. "Endless as drowned souls you will damn us," he croaked, voice shaking, yet beneath his words came another, fainter, rising from the hollow roots. "She will free us." He fled before dawn, hair turned white in patches, hands trembling so violently he could not hold his book. He spoke no sermons after that, his tongue swelling as though the swamp still gripped it from within. And Naomi, still she returned, kneeling at the water's lip, pressing her whispers into roots, and though none dared watch again, all knew when she did, for the swamp would shift, frogs falling silent, trees bowing, a deep pulse rising beneath the earth as though the very land listened. The night before the fire, she lingered longer than ever, her breath steady, her hands sunk so deep in the hollow roots that bark split beneath her fingers, and when she rose her palms bled black, not red, her footsteps trailing stains across the grass. By morning the cypress knees had grown taller, twisted higher, sharp as spears reaching skyward, as though they had fed on her whispers and found themselves strong again. And in their shadows no bird dared land, no insect dared crawl. All fled the grove as though it had been claimed. The girl who once followed Naomi swore she saw, in her dreams, roots moving like serpents, wrapping themselves around the great house while its family slept, squeezing until walls moaned like timber drowning. And when she woke, her bed was wet with swamp water. That was the last dream she spoke aloud, for each word left her teeth blackened, her gums bleeding, as though the swamp still punished her tongue for betraying what she had seen. And so when the fire came, none asked why the water turned away, why the swamp did not rise to quench the blaze, for they already knew. The swamp had already given Naomi its promise, and promises that heavy are never broken. The next morning, as ash settled over the ruin, children swore they saw her dress caught beneath the cypress roots, twisting deeper into the muck, tugged downward as if the swamp itself had swallowed her whole. And when the wind bent the trees, the hollow roots whispered again, carrying her name toward the burning fields, "Naomi, Naomi, Naomi." The fire had eaten everything, yet in the grey hush of morning, a glint remained among the ashes, small, stubborn, gleaming like a tooth in the jaw of a corpse. The silver comb lay where the mistress's dressing table once stood, scorched but unbroken, its teeth blackened at the tips, as though they had bitten something the flames could not destroy. The townsfolk who crept into the ruin did not speak above a murmur, their boots crunching on charred beams, their eyes restless, shifting. For the house no longer felt like a house. It felt like a grave unsealed, air swollen with smoke and memory. Every corner breathing the heat of voices still trapped in soot. "Leave it," one woman whispered, clutching her shawl tight. "Leave it in the ruin. It belongs to no hand now." But curiosity does not heed warnings. It gnaws, it claws, and one man bent low, his fingers trembling as he lifted the comb from the ash. And at once he shuddered, dropping it back with a cry, clutching his wrist as though bound, gasping, "God save me. Something's in my skin." Those who leaned close swore they saw nothing, but his wrist bore faint indentations, pale and long, circling like strands tightening, like hair winding though none could see it. And he swore he felt tugged downward, pulled toward the ground, as though something unseen had threaded into his veins. Still another took it, for silver was silver, and the mistress's comb, even scorched, might fetch coin. But when she pressed her thumb along its teeth, her breath caught, her eyes wide, her lips quivered, whispering words not her own, words of vanity, words of cruelty, words the mistress herself had once spoken to Naomi as she raked the comb through her hair until the scalp bled. "You will shine for me. Girl, even if I strip you raw." The woman dropped the comb at once, screaming, covering her mouth as though the words might slither back down her throat. Yet the whisper lingered in the ruin, repeating itself in air that should have been still. The comb passed hand to hand in the days that followed. Each who touched it claimed something different. One said she felt fingers braiding her hair, though none stood behind her. Another swore strands slid across her face in the night, thin and cold as worms. And one child, fool enough to pocket it, was found by morning strangled in her sleep, her mouth stuffed with her own locks, her eyes wide and glassy with terror. The preacher, his voice trembling, declared the comb cursed, a relic of wicked pride, he called it, and demanded it be buried in consecrated ground. Yet when they dug the earth for it, the shovel bent, metal twisted, as though the soil itself refused to hold it, and the comb fell back into ash, unclaimed, unwanted, still gleaming, and whispers spread, darker whispers, that it had not belonged to the mistress alone, that Naomi had touched it once late in the night, holding it in silence, pressing its teeth into her palm until blood welled, that she had whispered into it as she once whispered into roots, letting her pain slip into silver, letting her hatred braid itself into every strand it ever touched. "Her hair was long," murmured an old field hand, voice low, eyes averted. "And hair does not die, not truly, it lives. It remembers, it strangles, it binds, and so it did. For each night the comb remained unburied. The town heard faint scratching, soft at first, like rats in the rafters, then louder, more deliberate, scraping against windows, combing across shutters, until some swore they woke with their own hair braided tight against their throats, choking them in sleep. Though no hands had moved, a mother found her daughter weeping by candlelight, hair knotted into a crown she could not undo. Tight as rope, the child sobbing, "She's braiding me, Mama." She won't stop. Still the comb endured, blackened teeth gleaming, silver spine unbroken, and each dawn it returned to the ashes of the house, no matter where they cast it, as though drawn back to the ruin, as though waiting for one hand alone to claim it. And those who dared to watch the ruin by moonlight swore they saw her, Naomi, kneeling among the ashes, her hair long and flowing though her face was shadow, her hands weaving nothing into nothing. Yet when the wind stirred, the air hissed with strands unseen, brushing cheeks, coiling wrists, whispering against necks like soft promises before a blade. The comb, still gleaming, still waiting, lay upright in the ash the next morning, and when a brave fool leaned close enough, he swore he heard a voice rise from its teeth, not one voice but many, tangled, choking, all gasping the same name, pulling it long, dragging it through smoke. "Naomi, Naomi, Naomi." And as the sound grew sharper, another relic revealed itself from the soot, small and flickering, a lantern upright and glowing though its glass had melted, its flame bending toward the swamp as if pointing the way. The cotton did not wait for fire to ruin it. It sickened first, groaning like timber under unseen weight, stalks bending in moonlight, though no wind moved, the rows shifting as though restless in their own skin, and those who passed swore the earth itself breathed, heavy, low, a sigh that did not belong to soil. The overseer cursed the sound, said it was nothing but swamp air, yet his dogs would not cross the fence. They stood rigid, hackles raised, snarling at fields they once ran through, and their howls seemed answered, far down the rows. By a whisper not born of human throat, Naomi walked there, nights when even the frogs fell silent, her shadow stretching long, swallowed and swallowed again by rows that leaned toward her, each stalk bending as though eager, white blooms brushing against her skirts, curling inward. Not like flowers, but like fists clenched in rage. Some swore the cotton knew her, that it recognized her touch, for when others plucked the bowls, thorns bit, blood welled, hands blistered. But when Naomi reached out, the fibers softened, curling gently around her fingers like hair around a comb, clinging, unwilling to let her go, and the whispers rose then, thick as gnats, slipping between the stalks, carrying voices old and broken, voices heavy with years of bending and bleeding beneath that same white bloom, voices asking, "Will you carry us? Will you burn us? Will you let us rest?" Naomi bowed her head, lips moving, though no one close enough to watch could hear her words. Only the cotton responded, groaning, bending, whole rows collapsing as though listening too hard, too long, their blossoms twisting shut, curling like the knuckles of a buried fist. Children heard it too from their pallets, thin walls trembling with the hum of voices carried through stalks. One little boy swore he heard his grandmother's voice, though she'd been buried years, whispering his name from the rows, urging him to come, urging him to lie down in the blossoms and close his eyes by day. The fields looked the same, white stretching endless under sun, overseers shouting, sweat dripping, but even then, shadows lingered in the corners of eyes, and the sound of bending stalks could be heard beneath the whip's crack, faint, constant, like murmured prayer. The mistress mocked the fear, comb in hand, dragging silver teeth through her own hair, until strands broke and fell like threads of silk. She laughed, sharp, brittle. "The earth does not whisper, it obeys, and so do you." But her laughter cracked thin, for even she turned her head when the rows groaned too deep at night. And once, just once, the overseer swore he heard his own name hissed from between the stalks, drawn long, Jacob, and when he turned, torch high, he saw not Naomi, not any field hand, but the cotton itself bent into the shape of a woman's face, hollow-eyed, mouth wide, blossoms opening and closing like lips, whispering his name until the torch guttered out. He did not speak of it again, but his hair grayed early, and he kept his distance from Naomi, as if she carried the rose upon her back. One woman swore she saw Naomi lay flat among the cotton one night, arms spread, the stalks bending over her like mourners at a grave, blossoms closing against her skin, hiding her. And when she rose, she carried with her the sound of many voices, her own lips unmoving while the rows hissed behind her like serpents in grass. Not her voice, the woman whispered later, rocking, crossing herself, not her voice at all. But all of them, everyone buried in those fields, everyone still bent and bleeding. And then came the night the blooms themselves twisted, no longer soft, no longer white, but curled into knots hard as stone, clenched as fists, whole rows clutching at the sky as if to strangle it. Overseers fled then, muttering curses, clutching crosses, but the stalks bent not to them, only to Naomi, bending low, listening, waiting. The whispers grew too loud to be called whispers, a groaning chorus, words tangled, grief and rage and longing stitched into one, and they called for fire, not water, for ash, not harvest. They begged her, demanded her, burn us, burn them with us, let us rest. And Naomi did not answer. Not with her lips, not with her tongue, but the rose stilled as if satisfied, as if a promise had passed between them, too heavy for anyone else to hear. The night before the fire, stalks bent so low they scraped the earth, forming paths that led only to the house where the family slept. White blooms clenched tight, black veins visible in moonlight, and those who saw it swore the fields themselves pointed toward their masters, urging Naomi to finish what had been whispered into her bones. And when dawn broke, the house still stood quiet, untouched, but the cotton fields lay twisted, rows bowed low as if waiting for flame, blossoms curled like fists against the morning light. And in the stillness, the wind carried only one word through the stalks, drawn low, heavy, endless, Naomi. The silence in that house was not the silence of sleep. It was the silence of something already taken. The fire found them still, but their faces bore no terror, only a strange, hollow calm, as if they had already been claimed elsewhere. The neighbors who came at dawn told the tale in hushed tones, their boots sinking into the blackened earth, their eyes unable to leave the windows where the glass had melted down the sills like weeping wax. They said the fire had moved through the house with the patience of a priest, sparing nothing of timber or fabric, yet it left the family laid out in their beds unburned, the sheets still white around them, untouched by flame, as if fire itself had bowed in reverence. The father lay with his hands folded upon his chest, knuckles curled inward, as though clutching a prayer no one had taught him. The mother's lips were parted, but no cry lingered there. Only the faint shadow of a word spoken too quietly to ever be known. The children lay side by side in the narrow room above, faces pale, eyes sealed, their small fists unclenched, their breathing stolen, yet no violence etched into their bodies. "Not death by smoke," whispered one neighbor, his face trembling with sweat, though the air was cool. "Not death by flame." Something else laid claim first, and the others nodded, though they dared not speak further, for the air was heavy with the scent of charred cotton, and in that soot there was the faintest sweetness. Like the smell of lilies left too long in water, Naomi alone knew what had come. She had seen the shadows in the rows before the fire, shapes bending between the stalks, listening, learning, waiting. She knew the family had not awakened, because something deeper than fire had lulled them, something that hummed beneath the earth and drifted through the cracks of the house like a hymn no living throat could sing. At dusk, she returned to the field, her bare feet sinking into the ash where stalks had once clawed upward. And there, where the cotton rows ended and the tree line pressed close, she felt the ground still warm, pulsing faintly as though the earth itself drew breath. The trees leaned with unnatural tilt, their branches curved inward like ribs around a heart, and from their bark came a sound soft as sighs, whispers, calling not with words but with hunger. Naomi bent and pressed her ear to the soil, and in the dark hum she heard them, the voices of the family that slept too deep, whispering without mouths, carried through roots and marrow. "We were called before the fire," they breathed, called into the hollow places. Her body stiffened. Yet she could not rise. The ground seemed to hold her, every grain of ash clinging. The voices grew louder, rolling one upon another like water under stone. "It is not the fire that feeds. It is not the smoke that binds. We were chosen for silence, and silence is endless." She tore herself away, gasping. But when she lifted her eyes, she saw in the distance the faint silhouettes of the family standing among the blackened stalks, their forms dim as mist, faces pale with that same calm hollowness. They did not move, they did not blink, but the field leaned toward them. Bent in obedience, Naomi fled. But even as she crossed the boundary into the path beyond the farm, she heard them, voices trailing her, soft, patient, insistent. "Come, come. The soil keeps, the soil remembers, the soil sleeps too." And behind her the blackened house stood unshaken, its charred bones framed against the bruised horizon, a hollow shell that seemed to breathe in the gathering dark. Its windows glowed not with flame, but with a pale interior light, the kind of glow one finds deep beneath water, where no fire could ever live. By nightfall, no neighbor dared to pass. The fields had grown too still, the cotton rows too bent, the whispers too thick, curling in the air like smoke, though no fire remained. And as the moon rose over the silent farm, the shadows at the tree line stretched long, as though reaching for another house, another family, another set of sleepers to claim. No lantern should have survived that fire. No wick should have endured where timber wept into ash. Yet there it stood, upright in the barn, still glowing though the glass had melted. Its light did not flicker as fire ought to flicker. It bent, unwavering, in one direction, pointing toward the cypress swamp. The men who found it dared not touch it. Their voices were hushed, their boots scuffing the blackened floor where horses once stamped. One of them, trembling, spat into the dust and muttered, "Lanterns don't burn without oil, not after this." Another crossed himself but said nothing, for the silence of the barn was heavier than any prayer. Naomi lingered at the threshold, watching the bent flame lean like a finger. She knew fire, knew how it behaved, how it danced, how it died, but this was no fire she had ever known. This flame was not warm, its glow did not throw heat, only a cold shimmer that kissed the eyes but spared the skin, a ghost flame, tied not to oil nor wick but to will. Whispers stirred behind her, the neighbors urging to leave it, to bury it, to drown it in soil before it led them where no man should go. But Naomi's heart knew otherwise, for in that light she saw the memory of the family that had slept too deep, their faces calm, their silence endless, and she felt the pull of their unfinished hymn. That night, when the others retreated, Naomi returned. She stepped into the barn alone, her breath shallow, her skin damp with a sweat that came not from heat, but from dread. The lantern's light curved steady, unbroken, pointing always toward the swamp where cypress knees rose like bones from water. She whispered to herself, though she did not know why, "It wants me to follow." And from the bent flame came a hiss soft as a sigh, no louder than breath, but heavy with meaning. "Yes," it seemed to say, "follow." Naomi lifted the lantern, and though it should have burned her hand, it was cold as river stone. The flame bent sharply, pulling her like a leash, guiding her through the ashen field, over the ditch, into the mouth of the swamp. The cypress trees loomed tall, their roots writhing from black water like the hands of the drowned. Spanish moss hung in long curtains, brushing her face, dripping with night. The frogs that should have croaked fell silent, the air too still, as though the swamp itself had hushed in reverence. She followed deeper, the mud sucking at her heels, the lantern pulling her past, still pools where the moonlight broke and reformed in trembling shapes. At times she thought she saw faces in the reflection, hollow eyes, parted lips, pale as the family that never woke, but when she blinked they dissolved, leaving only black water. At the heart of the swamp, the lantern's flame bent sharply downward. Naomi stopped before a cypress, broader than 3 men, its roots plunging deep into water that looked bottomless. The lantern's flame hissed low, curling like a tongue tasting the air, and she felt a pressure in her chest, as if the swamp itself leaned close to listen. "Here," a voice whispered, not from the air, but from the water itself, deep and muffled. "They are here." Naomi clutched the lantern tighter, her knuckles pale. "Who is here?" she asked, though she already knew. "The ones who sleep too deep," the swamp replied, its voice seeping up through roots, through mud, through bone. "The ones the soil took, the ones silence claimed. They rest here, waiting, listening, dreaming." The water rippled though no wind passed, and in the shifting surface Naomi saw them, the family, pale, eyes sealed, mouths closed, their bodies drifting in black water as if cradled, their forms untouched by decay. They lay as they had lain in their beds, calm, hollow, claimed elsewhere. Naomi gasped, stepping back, but the lantern's flame bent harder, dragging her toward the water's edge. Her breath hitched, the swamp smell thick with rot and lilies. Her body trembling between terror and obedience. "They dream of you," the voice murmured. "They dream of fire, of fields, of hands. They are not gone. They are not dead. They are waiting to wake beneath your breath." Naomi dropped the lantern into the water, hoping the flame would drown, but it did not. It sank slow, glowing brighter, bending still toward deeper dark, illuminating faces beneath. Dozens now, not just the family, but others, pale and still, mouths closed, eyes sealed, all sleeping too deep. The swamp stirred, rippling outward, and the cypress groaned like a church beam breaking. From the water came a sound like many voices whispering at once, overlapping, choking, praying, calling, "Naomi, Naomi, Naomi!" She stumbled backward, but the lantern's glow swelled until the swamp itself lit pale as bone. Every trunk, every root, every surface reflecting hollow faces beneath, and in the reflection, Naomi saw herself, her face pale, her eyes closed, her lips parted as if already claimed. And the lantern, though sinking, burned on, its bent flame pointing deeper still, into black water that seemed to stretch forever. The swamp does not keep secrets. It feeds them back into the soil until they sprout like weeds. And when the fire had finished its hunger, when the lantern had bent its light toward the cypress, the earth spat out another story, one more terrible than the rest. The overseer was found the next morning, at the far edge of the fields. His body twisted in a posture no living man could hold. His mouth was gaping, blackened at the corners as if scorched from the inside. His tongue was gone, torn clean from its root, and yet his teeth were intact, unbroken. The white men whispered that Naomi had done it. They swore she had cursed him in the swamp, whispered into the cypress until the water rose up and took its payment. But the black hands who had bent under his whip did not whisper. They looked at the body and nodded in silence, for justice had spoken with a voice more final than any lash. The sheriff bent low, staring at the overseer's mouth. He muttered, There's no blood. Not a drop. A tongue torn leaves rivers. This one looks... Swallowed. His deputy crossed himself, but poorly, his hand trembling. The corpse stank not of death, but of smoke and raw soil, like something dug up, not freshly dead. That night the old women remembered his boasts, his threats, the way he had leaned against the cabin doors with his whip coiled like a snake in his palm. I'll break her tongue first. Then her back, he had told them, meaning Naomi. And now it was his tongue that had been silenced. Some swore that in the night they heard him still, choking, gagging, as though spitting out words that no longer belonged to him. They said his commands returned all at once, every order he had ever given pressed back into his throat, and that he had drowned in the weight of his own voice. Naomi stood by the well, watching the smoke curl low from the ashes of the house. She heard the men whisper of the overseer, their fear wrapped in half-spoken words. Her eyes did not move, but her lips parted, and a single whisper slid from her mouth. I warned him. The words trembled into the air, and someone near swore the wind carried them straight into the dead man's open mouth, where his tongue once lay. Later in the night, the slaves who kept vigil by the ashes heard something dragging through the dirt, a wet sound, slick and heavy, like an eel pulled from river mud. One man swore he saw it, something pale writhing in the moonlight, slipping from the overseer's lips and crawling into the furrows of the field, a tongue with no body, a command with no master, seeking another throat to claim. Don't speak of it, an old woman hissed, clutching her beads. Don't give it name, or it'll find you too. But silence is never enough to starve a curse. And already the children were whispering tales. In the morning, the field hands found rows of cotton bent low, their white heads bowed as though pressed beneath an unseen hand. And in the dust between the stalks, letters were traced, clumsy, sprawling, written not with ink nor blood, but with something slick and pale. They spelled no name in full. Only fragments, broken syllables. The overseer's body was gone by then. The sheriff swore he had ordered it buried, but the grave was empty, its soil clawed open from within. Only the coffin remained, gnawed at the corners, splintered with a violence that teeth alone could not manage. And that night, as the wind swept through the ruins of the cotton rows, a sound drifted with it, a voice raw and torn, echoing from nowhere, whispering in command, "Work, work, work!" But the hands who heard it did not move. They clutched their ears, knowing it was not meant for them. The sound grew louder, stretched thin until it was less word than shriek, until it snapped like a whip, and in the stillness after, every lantern flame in the cabins bent toward the swamp. Naomi, standing alone, felt the air thicken, as though something unseen leaned close to her cheek, breathing heavy, desperate, wordless, hungry for a mouth that would hold it again. She lifted her hand to her lips, and for a moment she thought she felt something press against them from the inside. She did not scream, she did not move, only whispered into the night, "You will not have me." But the silence that followed was not silence, it was waiting, thick and patient, as though the tongue of the overseer still crawled somewhere through the fields, seeking a throat that dared to speak. And when the moon reached its highest point, pale and sharp, those who watched from the cabins saw a shape rise in the cotton, tall and crooked, its mouth stretched too wide, its face torn in shadow, and though it had no tongue, it was trying endlessly to speak her name. Children are not meant to carry the weight of fire in their sleep. Yet the night the fields burned, the town's children rose screaming from their beds, their tiny palms blackened as though they had dipped their hands into soot. Though no flame had touched them, their cries tore through the dark like bells rung out of tune. "Mama, Mama, Naomi," they wailed, and the mothers froze, for most of these children had never once heard her name spoken in their homes. The sheriff's wife found her boy clawing at his sheets, his fingers smudged as if with ash. His eyes rolled back white. "Who told you that name?" she shouted, shaking him, but his lips only trembled, mouthing syllables in a voice too deep for a child's throat. Naomi stretched like a hymn dragged through coals. Word spread by dawn that nearly every child in town had woken the same, coughing soot, clutching blackened hands, whispering or crying the same forbidden name. Some even found tiny ashes beneath their nails, though no hearth in their homes had gone cold. The preacher thundered that Naomi's fire had leapt beyond fields into the dreams of innocence, that she had chained her curse to the tender flesh of children. "She is Eve in the swamp. She is Lilith in the rose," he roared, sweat soaking his collar. "And she will not stop until we are all hers. But the mothers said nothing. They looked at the small grey smudges clinging to their children's bedsheets, the faint smell of char that lingered in their hair. They prayed with trembling hands, yet their prayers felt brittle, breaking even as they spoke them. Naomi herself stood at the edge of the swamp, watching the morning mist curl from the cypress like smoke. She had not gone into town, but she felt them. The cries of the children pulling at her chest like threads wound too tight. She whispered low to the roots, "I did not call them." They came to me, and something in the water answered, "Yes, they dream as the fields dreamed. They belong to ash now. They see what has been hidden." That night, more dreams came. The children writhed in their beds, their little nails scratching splinters into headboards, their mouths filled with soot, though no chimney had fallen. They spoke not in their own voices, but in a chorus of deeper tones, old as the swamp. "She walks," they croaked. "She burns. She binds." Some swore the children's eyes did not close in sleep, that their lids stayed open, white and staring, as if the fire behind them could not be hidden. And in the corner of each room, where shadows should have lain still, a faint glow flickered, pale, trembling. Like a lantern flame bent always toward the swamp, the fathers tried to hush it with switches, striking their sons and daughters until the voices choked into silence. But when the lashes fell, the children only laughed, high, shrill and broken, like sparks snapping in wet wood. By the third night the laughter spread, thin at first, then louder. It drifted out of windows, across porches, spilling into the street until the whole town seemed alive with a mad choir of young throats. The sound bent the air thin and sharp, making even grown men cover their ears. The preacher's daughter was the first to be seen walking. She rose from her bed with blackened hands dangling limp, her bare feet carrying her down the steps and into the street. Her eyes glowed faint like embers. Her lips cracked with ash. She did not speak, but her mouth formed a name with every step. Naomi, Naomi, Naomi. One by one more children followed, a procession of small bodies stumbling through the night, their hands leaving smears of black along the fences, the doorposts, the walls of homes. They moved toward the cotton fields, or what was left of them, a ruin still smelling of fire. The parents tried to stop them, clutching their shoulders, dragging them back, but the children's limbs twisted strong as rope, their cries turning to shrieks sharp enough to split the night. A woman swore she saw her son's mouth split wider than it should, his scream carrying smoke like a chimney. By the time the moon sank, the children had scattered into the rows of charred stalks, vanishing like moths into shadow. Only their laughter remained, a ragged echo that made the dogs howl and the crows take wing. At dawn, the children were found back in their beds, their faces clean, their hands unmarked, their lips soft as though soot had never touched them. But under each bed lay small heaps of ash, still warm, and in every heap was the faint impression of fingers. Tiny, restless, still clawing, the sheriff gathered the fathers, demanded the town guard their doors, burn their beds, do anything to keep the curse from returning. But the mothers shook their heads, tears streaking their faces. "It won't matter," they whispered, "for when they sleep again, the ash will follow." And that night, when the first cries rose once more, they were not cries of fear, but of song. The children sang in voices layered with smoke, low and reverent, their hymn carried through the streets, bending toward the swamp. A prayer not to God but to Naomi, and from the cypress, something answered, a long low groan like the earth itself exhaling. The lantern flames in every cabin bent as one, all pointing toward the swamp, and the parents, helpless, trembling, saw their children's eyes open in the dark, glowing faint as coals. They were not asleep anymore. They were waiting, awake, their blackened hands folded like saints, their voices ready to call her name again. The river should have saved them. Its wide black mouth had swallowed storms, had drowned men and beasts alike, yet the night the cotton fields burned, it turned its face away. Men ran with buckets sloshing, their boots cutting deep ruts into the mud, their arms shaking under the weight of water. They hurled it upon the fire, yet the flames laughed, rising taller, fed not quenched. Each drop hissed into steam. Each bucket poured became nothing more than smoke twisting into the night. The river itself shuddered when touched, its surface boiling where it should have cooled, its edges seething as though the fire's reflection had climbed inside it and set it alight. "They ain't real flames," one man gasped, his shirt clinging to his chest, sweat burning on his skin. "No fire eats water like that." But another spat back, voice ragged with terror, Then it ain't fire we fight, it's her." The river moaned, low and strange, a sound that rolled under its current, not water but voice. Naomi's name again, drawn long, torn from the throat of something too old to belong to men. The horses broke first, screaming as they reared from the banks, their hooves thrashing mud into the air. Their eyes rolled white, their nostrils wide. They would not approach the water, would not drink, as though they too knew the river had soured. And when the men bent low to fill more buckets, they saw it, hands pale as clay, rising just beneath the surface, fingers clawing upward through the current, pressing against the underside of the water as if it were glass. Dozens, then hundreds, all writhing silently. One farmer screamed and dropped his pail. The water splashed but carried no coolness, only a smell of char and grave dirt. "They're in it," he stammered. "They're all in it. Look, look." But when the others leaned close, the hands dissolved, leaving only bubbles pale and bursting. The men told themselves they had seen nothing, yet the river's hiss grew louder, its froth spilling over its banks like spit from a furious mouth. Naomi stood on the far shore, her dress tattered, her hair wild. The smoke curled around her like a veil. The men shouted at her, cursed her, begged her to stop. Their voices cracked with fear, but she did not move. She only whispered, her words too soft to carry. Yet the river listened. "The current twisted at her feet like hounds at their master's heel, she calls it," one man muttered, his bucket slack in his hands. "She calls the river like a dog, and it obeys." But the river did not obey in kindness. It turned, twisting back from the fire as though recoiling. It boiled harder, its surface blistering like flesh. Each wave that should have spilled forward drew instead away, retreating into deeper dark. A boy, no older than 12, staggered forward with his bucket. His father shouted for him to stay back, but the boy only stared at the river, eyes wide, lips trembling. "It won't help us," he said, voice hollow. "It ain't ours anymore." Then he tipped his bucket not onto the fire, but back into the river, feeding it like an offering. The water hissed at the gift, swallowing it with a sound like teeth snapping shut, and in that hiss, voices rose, a chorus swelling low, dozens of tongues whispering, "Burn, burn, burn." The men fell back, their buckets abandoned. Their hands blistered, though no flame touched them. The air itself grew scalding. Each breath tore their throats raw, as if they had inhaled steam. The fire roared, but the river roared louder. It heaved in its bed, froth surging high, not as wave but as wall, a rising sheet of black water. Its crest shimmered not with moonlight but with fire, reflections of flames no man had kindled. "Run," someone screamed, and they did, dropping their tools, fleeing across the fields. But even as they fled, the water followed, not spilling outward but lifting higher, a thing alive, its voice rolling with the weight of graves and roots and ash. Naomi lifted her face to it. Her lips moved, but no sound escaped. Yet the river bent lower, groaning like a beast, bowing to her command. The fire bent too, its blaze twisting with the water, as though both were bound by the same leash, and then in one shuddering instant, the river fell still, flat as glass. The fire dimmed, but it did not die. It licked slow and steady, untouched, untouchable. The river had turned its face away entirely. By dawn, the banks were cracked, dry where they had never been dry. Fish lay stranded, their bodies bloated, their scales blackened as if smoked from within. The smell of rot rose thick and unending, and the townsfolk who came at first light found a shape scorched into the river mud. It was a body's outline, arms spread wide, mouth open, tongue thrust long, as if screaming even in the soil. The shape was too twisted to be named, but all knew it was the overseer who had vanished from his grave, pressed deep into the earth as though the river itself had spat him out. The mud still steamed, the outline still burned faint red beneath its crust, and as the people stood staring, their throats tight, their hearts trembling, the water shifted once more. From its black depth rose bubbles, slow, deliberate, one after another, and with each burst came a sound, soft but certain, a voice not of man nor woman, but of something older. "More," it whispered, "more fire, more." The earth does not always wait for the dead to be buried. Sometimes it swallows the living whole. The manor had stood for decades, its whitewashed timbers glaring over the cotton rows like the teeth of a skull. But by morning there was nothing but churned soil and a strange depression, as though the land had opened its mouth and devoured it. What remained above the dirt was not a shattered roof nor splintered beam, but a single crooked weather vane, rusted iron catching the pallid dawn, spinning without breath of wind. Moaning like a hinge that refused to shut, the townsfolk gathered at the pit, their shoes sinking in the damp soil, each whisper trembling into the mist that hung low like gauze. No one dared step too close to the edge, for the ground seemed to shift beneath itself, as if it were still chewing, still deciding whether to take more. They went down in their sleep, an old woman rasped, her voice broken reeds. The Lord himself laid his hand on the house and pressed it into the clay. But the others shook their heads, too afraid to give voice to the thought rising unbidden. Naomi's shadow had pressed it down, her vengeance weighing heavier than earth or stone. The preacher tried to pray, holding his Bible tight enough that the pages tore beneath his grip. Yet his words scattered as crows above them wheeled and screamed, circling the weather vane as if drawn to its ceaseless turning. Their wings beat a rhythm older than sermons, older than scripture. "Did you hear them in the night?" a boy asked, clinging to his mother's skirt. They were singing, but not from inside the house, from underneath, like the ground was full of voices. His mother hushed him, but her hand trembled as though she, too, had heard. The crowd shifted uneasily, each recalling the dream that had visited them in the black hours. Dreams of sinking staircases, of doors that opened onto soil, of beds that rocked as though on water, when the sheriff sent men down into the hollow with ropes. The earth rejected them, the soil crumbled, swallowed their boots. One fell to his knees and swore he heard laughter bubbling up from beneath, wet and choking, not of mirth but of mouths filled with dirt. They pulled him back, and his face was grey as the ash still clinging to the air by noon. The pit stank of rot, though no body had been found. The air grew thick, metallic, like blood that will not clot. And still the weather vane spun, pointing now east, now west, never resting, each turn like the twitch of a compass needle caught between two worlds. "Burn it shut," a voice called from the crowd. But who could burn what the earth itself had claimed? Fire had no dominion here. The manor had not been destroyed by flame, but by hunger, a deeper hunger, one that did not cease with ashes. The children whispered that Naomi was beneath, not as a body, but as a root, coiling through the beams, pulling the walls down, binding the family in their beds and dragging them into silence. One girl swore she saw pale fingers push up through the soil for a moment, reaching not to escape but to beckon. When night fell, they left the pit unmarked, too afraid to raise a cross, too afraid to bless the ground. They walked away in silence, though none turned their back fully, each step retreating sideways like prey, leaving the mouth of a predator. Yet long after the last of them departed, the lanterns fading into the black cypress swamp, the weather vane still moaned, turning, not in answer to the wind, but as though it were listening, tilting its iron arrow toward something deep below, something shifting restlessly in the clay. And just before midnight, when the moon lay strangled in clouds, the pit shuddered once, the soil cracking with a sigh, as if the earth had not yet finished its meal, as if it still had room for more. Some melodies are not learned but inherited, passed like scars through the blood, and no earth is deep enough to keep them silent. They said Naomi sang to herself as she bent over the rows of cotton, a low murmur, almost lost to the drone of cicadas. Yet the notes had a pull, slow and heavy, like the tide dragging a body beneath. Overseers warned her to hush, masters struck her lips raw, but still the hum returned, persistent, patient, as if the land itself leaned closer each time to listen. It was not a song the town recognized, not hymn nor psalm, but something older, the vowels long and aching, words blunted as if worn down by centuries of mouths. Those who labored beside her swore their hands moved easier when she sang, though their hearts beat harder, for there was a weight in it that made sleep restless and dreams sharp with firelight. On the night of the blaze, when the fields went red and the manor crumbled into soil, those who stood far across the river swore they heard the crackle of flame carrying a tune, the air itself bending to Naomi's lullaby, notes caught in the throat of the inferno, spilling back into the world she had left behind. "They're her words," one man whispered, clutching his wife. "But the fire's the one singing them now afterward." When the ash still floated in sheets, the town forbade mention of her name. The preacher declared her song a curse. The sheriff threatened to whip any who hummed it, and so they tried to bury it as they had tried to bury her. Yet music is not bound by earth nor by silence. It lingers like smoke in rafters, like breath against a window that refuses to clear. Children began to hum it in their sleep, lips parting without will. The sound so soft, their mothers leaned close to catch it, and each time a chill ran down their backs as if they had pressed their ear against a coffin lid and heard a voice rising inside. One child awoke screaming that the song was not in her mouth but in her chest. Clawing to get out in the swamps, frogs stilled when the tune was carried, and crows gathered thick upon branches, shifting restlessly as though waiting for a command. Even the cicadas, those endless choristers of summer, ceased, leaving a silence that pressed into the bones. And then just beneath the hush the melody returned, faint, winding. Like roots moving underfoot, the preacher himself was not spared. For one Sunday, as he rose to denounce Naomi once more, the first syllables caught in his throat, and to his horror, the words that left his lips were not scripture, but the opening line of her song. The congregation gasped, mothers seized their children, and the preacher collapsed, choking, as though Naomi's tune had stolen the very air from his lungs. "I heard it," a woman whispered outside, clutching her shawl. Not from him, no, from the fire itself. The church candles bent toward him as if listening. They doused the flames that day and held service in darkness. But still the walls seemed to hum with the faintest vibration, like strings plucked where no hand touched them. The elders declared it forbidden, demanded silence. But silence became a stage on which the song played clearer. At night, the wind carried it down the rows where blackened cotton still stood, each bowl opening with a sound too sharp, too human, as if mouths unsealing to sing. Travelers passing through claimed they heard women's voices braided with the cicadas, a chorus rising from the earth itself. By spring, the song had spread beyond the town, carried downriver, drifting into plantations miles away. Strangers muttering Naomi's words without knowing, fire following soon after, barns reduced to embers, houses smoking in the dawn, and always someone swore they heard music within the crackle, soft and mournful. Like a lullaby meant not for children but for the dead still. No one dared write the notes, no one dared hum them in daylight, yet every man, woman, and child carried some scrap of the melody in their marrow, waiting for the right hour when the dark pressed close and silence grew heavy, and then their lips would part against their will, letting Naomi's voice pass through them once more. And though they tried to bury her song beneath sermons, beneath earth, beneath the silence of fear, it was clear with each passing night that the lullaby had grown stronger, not weaker. It was not Naomi who lay buried in the ground, but the town itself, for the song was digging them down, verse by verse. There are nights when a man's soul bends, and if the fire is hot enough, it does not bend back when the cotton fields went up in flame. Witnesses swore not all ran from the blaze. Some turned, some walked toward it, their shoulders straight, their eyes fixed, not with terror but with a strange blazing calm, as though the fire was not enemy but invitation. Their bare feet cracked against soil already blackening with heat, their mouths opening, not screaming but singing, low, guttural. The same refrain Naomi once hummed in the Rose neighbors across the river, watched in horror, clutching their children to their skirts. "Why don't they run?" one man muttered. But the only answer was the groan of collapsing rafters and the unearthly sound of men and women vanishing into the glow as though swallowed by the mouth of something waiting. No bones were found the next morning, no curled fingers in the ash, no blackened skulls among the smoulder. Even the dogs set loose to sniff, turned in frantic circles before whining and backing away, tails tucked, as if the earth beneath the ruin held something it would not let them touch. Yet the embers betrayed them. For as the townsfolk sifted the ground with shovels and iron hooks, shadows crossed the coals, fleeting but sharp. The figures of men still stooped in labor, women still bent at the waist, children still darting between rows of stalks, but there were no bodies left to cast them. Only smoke that smelled too much of flesh. Some swore the vanished had not burned at all, that the fire was only a door and Naomi had opened it, a passage wide enough to take them down where no overseer could follow. "She led them," an old woman whispered, clutching her shawl, led them by the hand into the dark, and the dark took them whole. But others spat at the thought, saying it was no freedom they sought, but damnation they embraced, that whatever Naomi whispered beneath the cypress roots had wound into their marrow, hollowing them until the fire was all that remained. "You ain't seen eyes like that," the overseer's brother muttered. "Ain't human, no fear, no pain, just burning. like the blaze was looking out through them. And yet, as the smoke lifted, the mystery deepened, for the earth bore signs of footsteps, pressed deep into the ash, leading not away but toward the swamp, long lines of prints unbroken, vanishing at the water's edge, as if dozens had walked straight in without stirring a ripple, the surface still as glass, reflecting not moonlight, but the faint flicker of flame at night. The new overseers posted to the fields would not linger near the swamp, for they swore they heard rustling where no wind moved, and voices carried low, patient, the kind of voices that had spent lifetimes bent under sun and whip, voices now loose, now unchained. "You hear them too," one whispered. Clutching his lantern tight, they still working, out there in the dark. And sometimes, just before dawn, shadows rose where no stalks grew, men and women outlined in smoke, swinging unseen tools, bending as though plucking cotton that no longer bloomed. And then, before the eye could fully shape them, they would dissolve, folding back into the mist that clung low across the soil by midsummer. Strange things began to happen in nearby homes. A boy rising in his sleep to walk barefoot toward the fields, his parents finding him in the morning with black ash streaked across his palms. A girl humming Naomi's lullaby while staring into the hearth until sparks leapt onto the rug, and always, always the same whisper in the night. Not from the mouth, but from the rafters. The chimneys, the soil itself, "We are not gone. We are not gone." And the worst was the sight seen by the ferryman. Drifting across the river one moonless night, lanterns swaying above the black water, when he looked to the burned fields, he froze, for there, rising from the embers, were lines of figures, not flesh, not smoke, but something in between, their faces lit with a dull glow, their eyes still fixed forward, walking, as though they had not stopped since the fire, as though their journey was not yet done by the time he told it. His hair had turned white, and he would not set his boat across again, for he swore that when he raised his lantern, one figure lifted its head toward him, and though its mouth did not move, the ferryman heard a voice pressed directly into his skull, Naomi's voice, low and certain. "The work is not finished. Time itself can rot, and when it does, the sound of its decay rings louder than any church bell. On the night Naomi's fire rose, the courthouse clock struck midnight. But it did not stop. It struck once, then again, the hammer falling with a patience that defied the gears, the pendulum swinging like a noose in the rafters, each toll echoing through the town, until even the river seemed to ripple with its sound. Those who woke to its tolling thought it an omen, a warning that would pass with the smoke. But by dawn, the hands still pointed to midnight. The bell still cried the hour of the blaze, its clang hollow, metallic and endless, rattling the windows of shops, shuddering the floorboards of the tavern, pressing against the skulls of children until they whimpered in their sleep. Men climbed the tower to silence it, their boots echoing up the spiral stair. But when they reached the gears, they found no mechanism moving. The hammer fell, though no wheel turned. The weight chains hung still, untouched, the brass face frozen, yet the toll continued. Every swing striking as though time had been pried open and nailed to the sound of its own death. "It ain't the clock no more," one of them whispered. Pale as he stumbled down the steps, "It's her steps, walking back to us by the third night." No one slept. The bell rang each hour, then each half-hour, then each quarter, until the town felt hollowed by the endless hammer, its echo rolling across the empty fields where ash still drifted. Mothers covered their children's ears with cloth. Men stuffed the windows with rags. But still the toll seeped through, steady, patient, like water finding cracks in stone. The preacher gathered his flock in the square, shouting above the clang that it was the devil's hand upon the bell. But even as he spoke, the sound bent, took on a pattern, a rhythm not unlike Naomi's song. The lullaby stretched into brass and iron. The voice of her melody now carried on steel. The congregation fell silent, their lips trembling, because they knew the tune, and then came the witnesses, those who claimed that when the bell struck, the air around them shivered, bending as though struck by invisible feet. One woman fainted in the market, insisting she had seen the imprint of bare toes appear in the dust beside her, pressing deep as though someone had passed close enough to brush her skirts. "The clock ain't chiming hours," an old man croaked, eyes wide. "It's marking steps, hers. Every toll another footfall back toward town." By the seventh night, the bell cracked, a jagged fissure running its side. Yet still it tolled, the sound now warped, deeper, as though struck from inside, rattling ribs making the marrow ache. And with every toll, shutters swung open, Doors unlatched themselves, locks gave way, as if the sound had hands of its own, prying open what the town wished shut. A blacksmith swore he saw fire spill down the tower with each strike, not sparks but flame in the shape of a woman's hand, sliding along the brick, curling into the street before vanishing. And when the bell tolled again, the hand appeared closer, crawling, reaching, the iron of the tower glowing faint as though gripped from within. The courthouse itself began to sink, the foundation trembling with each blow of the hammer, dust falling from the rafters, plaster splitting, and yet still the townsfolk dared not tear the tower down, for they whispered, if the clock was destroyed, Naomi herself would have no barrier, no tether, and her steps would no longer echo. They would arrive on the 9th night. As the moon bled thin over the swamp, the bell tolled once more, and the townsfolk swore they heard not iron but breath, the sound of exhale turning metal into voice, and in its hollow cry was a single word, stretched, drawn, unmistakable. Her name, Naomi. The sheriff fled that night, horse wild beneath him, yet by dawn he had not reached the next town. His body was found twisted in the road, eyes wide, mouth frozen open, as though the bell had tolled inside his skull. And still the courthouse clock kept chiming, the hands locked on midnight, the hour of fire, each strike louder than the last, and with every toll, the shadows of bare feet deepened across the square, circling the tower in a widening spiral, until it seemed the whole town stood upon Naomi's path, waiting for the next step. The trial began before dawn, when the mist still clung to the cobblestones like the breath of the buried, and though the town square was filled with bodies, no one dared claim they had come of their own will. It was as though the bells had summoned them. Not men, not women, not law. The accused stood shackled, but the chains themselves seemed reluctant, each iron link trembling as though aware of the weight they carried, her face pale and still, her eyes unblinking, as if she were not waiting for judgment, but merely for the hour. The judge ascended his seat, a man whose lips rarely trembled, yet today they quivered like wax in the flame. He opened his ledger, but the ink across its pages had blurred, letters curling back into smoke, names erased by unseen hands. They called for witnesses, yet none came forward willingly. Instead, the crowd seemed to fracture, one voice rising from the throat of another. A baker spoke, but the words belonged to the blacksmith. The blacksmith spoke, but the syllables fell in the cadence of the midwife, each testimony echoing like a borrowed tongue, stolen, twisted, forced through lips that were not its own. "I saw her in the woods," murmured the midwife, yet her eyes widened in horror as the voice that carried her words was that of her dead brother. "A man buried these 15 years. She cursed my child," said the blacksmith. Yet the sound was shrill, the voice of a girl who drowned last winter, throat still full of water. "She walks with shadows," whispered the baker, but it was not his tone. It was the low growl of wolves heard in the distance of frozen fields. Murmurs rose in the crowd, hands clenched over mouths, as if they feared the same plague of voices might pass into them. The air was heavy, not with heat, but with something thicker, the slow suffocation of truth itself. The judge struck the gavel. Once, twice. Yet on the third strike the wood split down the middle. The sound was like a bone breaking, sharp and final. The handle fell from his palm and rolled across the stones, stopping at the feet of the accused, and though she never lowered her gaze, the faintest curl of a smile ghosted her lips. No record could be written. The clerks dipped their quills but found no ink. The wells had dried, parchment wrinkled and blackened as if scorched by invisible flame. Even the names of the day and month could not be inscribed. As though the trial itself resisted being remembered, a priest stepped forward, desperate to restore order, clutching his crucifix so tightly the edges cut his hand, blood dripping onto his robes. He spoke a prayer, but when the crowd leaned in, they heard not Latin, not blessing, but the guttural syllables of another tongue, older, colder, crawling like roots through soil. The priest fell silent, his eyes empty, and the crucifix bent in his hands, the metal twisting without heat. As though refusing to stand upright in her presence, the crowd shifted, restless, faces pale, as if each feared they too might be called to speak with voices not their own, yet none could leave. The mist held them, thickened around the square, a wall without walls, and somewhere in the distance bells rang, though no church had called them to be struck. The judge cleared his throat, but his voice faltered, for when he tried to pronounce her name, his tongue knotted, his teeth clamped, blood seeping between them. Every attempt to name her was swallowed. Broken, silenced, and so she stood unmarked, nameless. "Untethered, you must answer," he whispered. Though the command carried no weight, "You must answer." For the first time, the accused raised her eyes to him, and though no word left her lips, the judge's own voice answered in return, his mouth shaping syllables against his will, his sentence not his own. The crowd gasped. Some fell to their knees, others clawed at their ears, yet none could deny what they heard. The judge condemning himself, speaking his own doom in her silence. The sky shifted then. Though it was day, the mist darkened to the color of ash, and a single crow landed upon the judge's shoulder, talons sinking deep, its beak brushing against his ear as though whispering counsel. The trial ended without verdict, without record, without law, yet all who stood there felt the weight of judgment nonetheless. For as the chains fell from her wrists, untouched, unbroken, each man and woman in the square felt their own breath grow heavy, their own name curl back into silence, and when the crowd finally dispersed, the benches empty, the judge's seat abandoned, the gavel splintered to dust, the square itself felt altered, colder, as though it had witnessed something it should never tell. But still, on certain nights when the fog returns and the air is thick with the taste of rust, the townsfolk swear they can hear it, the voices of the witnesses, speaking through one another still, testifying to a trial that never truly ended. Their words carried on the wind like verdicts, unfinished, eternal, and at the center of the square, where no grass dares grow, where even weeds refuse to root. The faint outline of a woman's shadow remains scorched into the stone, though no sun has touched it. The chapter closes with the image of the judge's chair still standing empty, yet on its cushion lies a single object that no one remembers placing there. The broken half of the gavel, damp as though held by unseen hands, waiting for the trial to resume. The fields never slept, though the overseers swore they did, and the planters turned their faces away at night, pretending the land was still theirs, still living, still fertile. Yet all who walked its rows felt the breath of something unsettled pressing against their skin, as though the soil itself remembered more than it should. The cotton had been replanted, acre upon acre, white blooms against the blackened scars of old fire. But no matter how often the seeds were sown, no matter how many hands bled into the earth, each harvest came back wrong. The fiber dulled, ashen, brittle to the touch, a crop that seemed half burned before it was ever plucked. Children who strayed into the rows swore they returned with soot upon their palms, though they had touched nothing, and their mothers scrubbed until skin turned raw. But the blackness remained, settled deep like bruises. The men spoke in low voices of Naomi, though never by name, for they feared even syllables carried across the fields might call her back. Yet the land did not need calling, it remembered. It carried her in the cracks of its furrows, in the silence that fell before the wind, in the groan of branches bowing against no weight at all at dusk. The wind shifted, carrying with it ash that had no source, faint flakes falling upon shoulders, into hair, onto the lips of those too slow to cover their mouths. The taste bitter, metallic, clinging long after the sky cleared. And when the overseers cursed and spat, their voices came back to them doubled, as though the rows themselves had learned how to mock them once. A preacher stood at the edge of the field, Bible raised, promising to cleanse the land with scripture. Yet when he opened his mouth, no word of comfort came forth, only a dry hiss like kindling catching, like flame without fire, and the Bible curled in his hands, pages blackening, the ink running like blood across his wrists. The slaves who had survived whispered more openly, for they knew what the others would not confess. Naomi's body had burned, yes, but her name had not. Her fury had not. Her shadow had not. And what the fire had devoured only scattered her deeper into the ground, like seeds more potent than cotton itself. "She walks when the mist does," an old woman murmured, her hands trembling over a child's hair. "Not with footsteps, no." "But with the settling of ash," answered another. "She does not leave," said a third, voice breaking. "She never left, she never will." At night the rows shifted, as if ploughed by invisible hands, long furrows forming where no tool had been, leading inward toward a single point none dared follow. And in the morning the stalks were bent low. Cotton bowls opened too soon, spilling grey fibers like spider silk across the dirt. A boy, foolish with youth, once carried a handful of that grey harvest into town, hoping to trade it for coin. But when the clothier touched it, her fingers blistered, skin peeling back in ribbons, and though she screamed for water, her throat filled instead with smoke, and the boy swore he saw Naomi's face in the grey wisps rising from her open mouth still. They replanted because land was land and coin was coin, and blood was always cheaper than truth. Yet each year the crop worsened, until the overseers found themselves staring at fields that grew more ash than fibre, more shadow than stalk, and still they could not stop, for the land would not let them. The rose pulled them back season after season, as though feeding not the market. But her one evening, as the sun bled low, the wind rose without warning, carrying ash so thick it darkened the sky, and voices came with it. A chorus of whispers not carried from mouths but from soil, roots stone. Naomi never left, the earth breathed. "Naomi waits," hissed the stalks. "Naomi burns," moaned the wind. The overseers fled the rows, eyes blinded by grey storm, ears filled with the sound of rattling chains, though none were seen. And when they reached the edges of the field, they found their footprints gone, swallowed, erased, as though the land had claimed the memory of their passage. At the heart of the field, where the fire had first begun, the ash thickened, swirling upward into a shape not entirely human, not entirely smoke, not entirely shadow, yet all who saw it knew her, though they dared not name her. For her name was now the land, the crop, the silence, the storm. And when the ash settled, when the sky cleared, the cotton stood grey, endless, heavy with a harvest no market would take. A harvest meant for no man's hands. Still, they picked it, trembling, weeping, cursing under breath, for to leave it unplucked was worse. They knew to leave it was to invite her closer, and each bowl they tore left streaks of soot upon their skin that no river could wash away. The chapter ends with the fields at night, moon-pale ash drifting where no fire burns, and the faintest outline of Naomi's figure walking the rows, her shadow long, her head bowed, her hands brushing the cotton, as though tending not crops but graves, whispering to the earth that fed her still, waiting for the next harvest to rise in grey.